Picture this. You're driving alone on Route 9 after midnight. The dashboard clock glowing 2:47 a.m. when you see him in your rearview mirror. A semi-truck appearing from nowhere, headlights cutting through the darkness like eyes that have seen too much. And suddenly you remember the stories truckers tell at rest stops, their voices dropping to whispers about the driver who only appears on this stretch of highway after the world goes quiet. The one who pulls over for hitchhikers nobody else can see. Have you ever wondered why some people disappear on perfectly safe roads? Their cars found abandoned with no sign of struggle, no explanation. Just an eerie emptiness that makes local cops shake their heads and close the case files. What if I told you there's a driver out there who knows exactly where those missing people went? Because he's the one who gave them their final ride. The truckers who work the night shifts on Route 9 have a name for him. They call him the Ghost Driver. And once you hear what happened to Jake Morrison, a long-haul trucker with 20 years on the road who swears he saw this phantom semi pick up his own brother 3 months after the funeral, you'll understand why veteran drivers take the long way around this particular stretch of asphalt when the clock strikes 12. Jake was hauling a load of electronics from Denver to Chicago, fighting to stay awake with his third cup of coffee going cold in the holder, when he saw the impossible. His brother Tommy standing on the shoulder of Route 9, thumb out, wearing the same flannel shirt he was buried in. And behind him, slowing down with a hiss of air brakes, was a semi-truck that seemed to shimmer at the edges, its license plate reading nothing but static in the darkness. This is the story that made Jake quit trucking forever. The encounter that sent him to 3 different therapists who all said the same thing. Grief can make us see things that aren't there. Except Jake knows what he saw. And more importantly, he knows why some souls never make it to their destination. If this sends chills down your spine, hit that subscribe button, because the darkest roads have the darkest stories. Jake Morrison had been sitting in that diner off exit 47 for 3 hours now, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold twice, telling his story to anyone who would listen, but mostly just staring at the security footage he'd managed to pull from his own dash cam that night on Route 9. Footage that showed his brother Tommy standing there, clear as day. Even though Tommy had been dead for 3 months after that head-on collision with a drunk driver on Interstate 70. The other truckers in the diner had stopped laughing after Jake showed them the timestamp. 2:47 a.m., the exact minute Tommy had died according to the coroner's report. And now they sat in uncomfortable silence. Some crossing themselves, others suddenly remembering they had loads to deliver. Jake rewound the footage again, pointing at the screen where you could see the semi-truck pulling over, its trailer seeming to flicker like bad reception on an old TV. And that's when old Marcus, who'd been driving Route 9 for 40 years, finally spoke up. "I've seen him too, the Ghost Driver. Picked up my nephew Samuel 2 years back, except Samuel had drowned in Lake Harrison when he was 7 years old." The temperature in the diner seemed to drop as Marcus continued, explaining how the Ghost Driver's truck didn't sound right, how its engine made a sound like whispers instead of diesel combustion, how the headlights cast shadows that moved independently of the light source, and how anyone who got close enough to read the company name on the door would see it constantly changing. Allied Transport, Eternal Logistics, Crossroads Freight, Final Mile Services. Never staying the same for more than a second, Jake's footage showed Tommy climbing into that cab, turning back once to look directly at Jake's truck with eyes that reflected light like a cat's before disappearing into the passenger seat. And then the impossible happened. The Ghost Driver's semi didn't drive away. It simply faded, becoming transparent until only the empty shoulder remained. What Jake didn't tell the others in the diner was what he heard on his CB radio right after. Tommy's voice coming through the static, saying, "I'm almost home, Jake, just one more stop." Followed by coordinates that led to a section of Route 9 where 17 people had gone missing in the last decade. Their cars found running but empty, doors open, personal belongings still warm to the touch. The ghost driver, Jake had come to believe, wasn't taking people somewhere evil. He was collecting souls that had gotten lost between life and death, trapped in that liminal space where the highway becomes something more than asphalt and painted lines, where every mile marker counts down to 0, and where the destination on your GPS keeps changing to places that don't exist on any map. Jake pulled out a crumpled piece of paper where he'd written those coordinates: 41.7834 degrees, 88.191 65 W, and spread it on the diner's greasy table, his finger trembling as he pointed to a spot on Route 9 that every local trucker knew but never talked about. A 5-mile stretch they called the Nowhere Road, where GPS systems glitched out and returned error messages, where AM radio picked up stations that had been off the air since the 1960s, and where more than one driver had reported seeing people walking along the shoulder who vanished when you got close enough to offer help. Marcus leaned in, his weathered face going pale as he recognized the location. And that's when he told Jake something that made everything else make terrible sense. That's where they built Route 9 over the old Garrison Cemetery back in '58. Moved most of the bodies, but not all. And my grandfather, who worked that construction crew, said they found mass graves from a frontier cholera outbreak. Hundreds of souls who died on their way west, trying to reach somewhere they'd never arrive. The fluorescent lights in the diner flickered as Jake explained what he'd discovered in his research. Spending sleepless nights in library archives and newspaper morgues, finding a pattern that went back decades. Every person who'd gone missing on that stretch had been traveling to reunite with someone, heading to hospitals where loved ones lay dying, racing to weddings they'd never attend, driving through the night to say goodbye to parents who would pass before dawn. All of them desperate to reach someone before it was too late. The ghost driver, Jake theorized, wasn't randomly choosing passengers. He was collecting those whose journey had been interrupted by death, either their own or the person they were trying to reach. Souls caught in an endless loop of almost making it, forever trying to complete a trip that had become impossible the moment their destination ceased to exist. Jake's brother Tommy had been driving to the hospital where Jake was supposed to be having emergency surgery for a burst appendix, except Jake's surgery had been postponed at the last minute. A detail Tommy never learned before that drunk driver crossed the median, which meant Tommy died trying to reach a destination that had already changed, trapping him in that space between intention and arrival, where the ghost driver hunts. Marcus suddenly grabbed Jake's arm, his grip tight with fear, whispering that he'd been getting calls from his wife saying she'd seen their son Bobby at truck stops along Route 9. Except Bobby was stationed in Afghanistan. And just that morning, Marcus had gotten word that Bobby's convoy had hit an IED 3 days ago, which meant God help them. Bobby might be out there right now, standing on some dark shoulder with his thumb out, waiting for a ride in a truck that existed between nowhere and neverwhere. The diner's payphone rang, cutting through the tension like a blade. And when the waitress answered, her face went white as she held out the receiver to Jake. "It's for you," she said. And through the crackling static came Tommy's voice, distant and hollow, saying, "Jake, the driver says you're next. You've been trying to get home for 20 years, but home stopped existing the day Dad sold the farm. And now you're driving in circles, brother, just driving in circles, and he's coming to help you find where you're really supposed to be." Jake's hand shook as he set down the receiver. the dial tone droning like a flat line in his ear. And Marcus was already backing toward the door, muttering prayers under his breath. But Jake grabbed his shoulder because he just remembered something that changed everything. The ghost driver didn't just take passengers. He left something behind at each pickup spot. A small brass compass that always pointed to where the lost soul was trying to go. And Jake had found one in Tommy's abandoned car, still pointing west toward a home that no longer existed. The waitress, her name tag reading Dolores, suddenly spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. My husband Earl was a trucker too. Disappeared on Route 9 17 years ago this November. Left behind one of those compasses on our kitchen table pointing to the hospital where our daughter was supposed to be born. Except she was stillborn 3 hours before he vanished. And sometimes I still see him in other truckers' mirrors, forever driving to meet a daughter who never took her first breath. Jake pulled out his own compass, the one he'd kept in his pocket like a talisman, watching as the needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that made no geographical sense. It pointed straight down, as if his destination lay somewhere beneath the asphalt itself, and that's when the lights in the diner began to dim one by one, starting from the back booth and moving forward like something approaching through the shadows. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, just coordinates. The exact spot on Route 9 where Bobby's favorite truck stop used to be before it burned down in 2003. The place where father and son would meet whenever their routes crossed. Now just an empty lot with weeds growing through cracked concrete. But Marcus knew with horrible certainty that if he drove there tonight, he'd find Bobby waiting with his duffel bag, still in his combat fatigues, needing a ride to a home where his childhood bedroom had been converted to an office years ago. The temperature in the diner dropped 20 degrees in seconds, frost spreading across the windows in patterns that looked like maps of roads that didn't exist. And through the glass, they could see him, the ghost driver himself, standing beside a semi that seemed to be made of solidified shadow. Its trailer doors opened to reveal an interior that stretched impossibly far, filled with passengers who sat in eternal silence, all of them still traveling to destinations that had slipped out of existence like smoke through fingers. Jake understood then what he had to do, what the only way to save Marcus from the same fate might be. He walked toward the door, each step feeling like sinking into quicksand, because maybe if he went willingly, if he accepted his place among the eternally traveling, the ghost driver would leave the living alone for one more night. But as his hand touched the door handle, he heard it. The sound of air brakes releasing, Bobby's voice calling out, "Dad?" from somewhere in the parking lot, and Marcus's anguished cry as he realized his son had already been collected, was already sitting in that impossible trailer, waiting for his father to join him on a journey to nowhere. Marcus lunged for the door, but his legs wouldn't obey. Frozen in place as if the diner floor had become quicksand, and through the frost-covered window, he watched Bobby climb into the ghost driver's rig with mechanical movements, like a sleepwalker drawn to a nightmare. While Jake stood between worlds, his hand on the door handle but his body refusing to cross the threshold. Caught in that terrible moment of choosing between the living and the lost, Dolores began to sob, not with fresh grief, but with the exhausted tears of someone who'd been mourning for 17 years. And she whispered that she'd seen this before. Seen fathers follow sons, mothers follow daughters, entire families boarding that shadow truck one by one until whole bloodlines vanished from the world of the living. Their only legacy being brass compasses spinning in empty houses, pointing toward reunions that could never happen in any place the living could reach. The ghost driver turned his head, or where a head should be, for his face was a void that seemed to drink in light. And Jake heard him speak without words, the message arriving directly in his mind like ice crystals forming on neural pathways. Every road has an end, every journey a destination. But some souls refuse to accept where they've arrived. So they keep driving, keep searching, keep picking up others who share their denial. And your brother Tommy wasn't taken, Jake. He chose to ride because he couldn't bear to reach the nowhere that waits at the end of every map. Marcus's phone rang, Bobby's number on the screen, and when he answered with trembling fingers, his son's voice came through static, wrapped and distant. "Dad, I'm almost there. Just a few more miles to go. Mom's waiting at the house with dinner. She made my favorite. Remember how she used to make pot roast on Sundays before the IED, before everything went dark?" But Marcus knew his ex-wife had remarried, moved to Portland, and the house Bobby remembered had been demolished for a strip mall in 2015. Jake felt the compass in his pocket growing hot, burning through the fabric. And when he pulled it out, the brass was glowing like a coal. The needle not pointing anymore, but spinning so fast it had become a blur. And in that blur, he could see faces. Tommy's face, Bobby's face, Earl's face, and thousands more. All the passengers of the ghost driver's eternal route, their eyes reflecting headlights that would never dim, following roads that curved through dimensions where time and distance meant nothing. The diner began to shake. Coffee cups rattling off tables, the jukebox in the corner suddenly blazing to life, playing a song nobody recognized, something that sounded like tires on wet asphalt mixed with distant sirens. And Jake realized with perfect, terrible clarity that they weren't in the real diner anymore, hadn't been since the ghost driver arrived. They were in a way station between worlds, a rest stop for souls who didn't know they were lost. And the only way out was to accept a truth that would destroy everything they believed about life, death, and the spaces between. The windows of the diner began to frost over from the inside, ice spreading in patterns that looked like road maps to nowhere. And Jake watched helplessly as Marcus dropped his phone, the device clattering on the linoleum as Bobby's voice continued to speak from the speaker, describing a journey that had ended 3 years ago in Kandahar, while outside the ghost driver's semi idled with a sound like breathing, like the last exhale of everyone who'd ever died far from home. Dolores stood up from her booth, her weathered hands clutching a photograph Jake hadn't noticed before, Earl in his younger days, standing next to a rig identical to the one waiting outside. And she said Earl had been picking up ghost passengers for years before he became one himself. That some drivers are chosen not to transport the living, but to ferry the lost. And once you accept that calling, you can never fully return to the world of flesh and blood and morning coffee. The brass compass in Jake's hand suddenly stopped spinning and pointed directly at him, its needle quivering with anticipation. And he understood with crushing certainty that the ghost driver wasn't just collecting random souls, but following bloodlines, harvesting entire family trees, one member at a time. And Tommy had been the doorway through which the darkness would eventually claim Jake himself. Marcus was moving toward the door now, each step deliberate and final, saying he could hear his wife calling, not his ex-wife, but his wife the way she was before the deployment, before the arguments, before Bobby came home in a flag-draped coffin. And Jake grabbed his arm, but his hand passed through like Marcus was already more ghost than man, already accepting his place in the ghost driver's manifest. The temperature dropped so suddenly, their breath became visible. And in those small clouds of exhalation, Jake could see scenes playing out. Tommy getting into the ghost rig 3 months ago, Marcus's wife standing at a kitchen window that no longer existed. Earl picking up passengers at this very diner in 1987, 1994, 2001. An endless cycle of collection and departure that had turned Route 9 into a supernatural thoroughfare where the living and dead intersected every night after midnight. Dolores pulled out a second compass from her apron, this one silver instead of brass, and pressed it into Jake's palm alongside the burning bronze one, explaining through tears that two compasses could break the cycle. One pointing to where souls wanted to go, the other showing where they needed to be. But the choice would cost everything. Would mean accepting that Tommy was gone, that Bobby was gone, that the ghost driver only had power over those who couldn't let go. And letting go meant watching everyone you loved disappear into the nothing that waited beyond the headlights. The ghost driver's horn sounded once, twice, 3 times, each blast shaking reality like thunder. And through the diner's door, Jake could see the impossible. Hundreds of semi-trucks stretching back along Route 9, each one driven by someone who'd chosen reunion over release. Their headlights forming a constellation of denial that lit up the night with the cold glow of unfinished business. And at the head of this eternal convoy, Tommy sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck, his eyes reflecting not recognition, but invitation, his lips forming words Jake could read even from this distance. Come on, brother. The road goes on forever, and we've got so much catching up to do. Jake stood there holding both compasses as they began to vibrate in perfect opposition. One pulling toward the convoy of ghost trucks, and the other toward the empty darkness beyond the diner's back door. And he realized this was the choice every living soul on Route 9 eventually faced: follow the dead into their endless loop of midnight runs, or walk away into the uncertain silence of acceptance. When Marcus suddenly stopped at the threshold, his translucent form flickering between 2 states of being, and whispered that he could see it now. The truth the ghost driver had been hiding. The trucks weren't taking souls anywhere. They were keeping them, preserving them in an eternal moment between departure and arrival, between goodbye and hello, between the last breath and whatever comes after. The silver compass in Jake's left hand grew ice cold while the brass one burned like a coal, and Dolores stepped forward to reveal the final secret. She'd been dead for 15 years, killed in a pileup on Route 9, choosing to stay and warn the living rather than join Earl's convoy. And as this revelation shattered Jake's perception, the diner itself began to fade, its walls becoming transparent, showing it existed in 2 realities simultaneously. One where the living stopped for coffee, another where the dead waited for rides that would never truly take them home. Jake raised both compasses high and brought them together with a sound like breaking glass, like tearing metal, like every goodbye ever spoken. And the convoy of trucks began to dissolve backward from Tommy's vehicle, each one vanishing with its driver's last memory of home, until only the original ghost driver remained. And Jake finally understood. There was no ghost driver. There never had been. Only the collective weight of those who couldn't let go, manifesting as a legend that fed on grief. And by refusing both compasses, by dropping them to shatter on the floor, he broke the cycle not just for himself, but for everyone trapped in Route 9's midnight purgatory, watching as Tommy smiled one last time, genuinely this time, before fading into the peace he should have found 3 months ago.